Hello and welcome to the 23rd in my series of presentations on the conflict between science and creationism. Today I'm going to be talking about the subject of education and the views espoused by many young earth creationists on the subject of how children should be taught. There won't be many surprises in this section, as I'm sure you'll agree, but I wanted to approach a number of the more common concerns anyway. In particular in this presentation I'll be looking at a number of claims, as ever, made in the presentations of the infamous young earth creationist Kent Hovind. This means that I won't be covering the whole topic, and I won't even be covering it in any sensible order. I'll just cover the topics that Hovind himself mentions. So let's get started. Hovind's general strategy is to put forward the assumption that atheism is a failure of intellect and the result of brainwashing, whereas in most cases the reverse is of course true. Most atheists I know of started off as religious and then came to their atheism by a long and slow process of careful thought and deliberation. Of course, to a fundamentalist believer this looks very different. To them, watching a former believer renounce their faith means that they have been swayed by the forces of evil, and hence that the reason for this change of mind is that the former believer has been exposed to temptation and malicious Machiavellian forces who have seduced them into some sort of Faustian deal for their immortal souls in exchange for a life of hedonism, immorality and excess. In reality, atheism is a perfectly reasonable, academically defensible position. In fact, it is the most academically defensible of all positions on the subject of religion. That doesn't mean it's right, of course, but it certainly doesn't imply that it's either immoral or the result of brainwashing. In fact, it's usually the result of clear, rational and informed thought. Obviously, the main factor, therefore, leading people to atheism is education. And I don't just mean education in the ways of science and history, but also education about their own faiths and those of others, and the social education that comes with meeting people of other faiths, perhaps having lived an incredibly isolated life for, say, 18 years, and finally realising that atheists and those of other faiths are not the evil, immoral demons that they have been portrayed to be by fundamentalist parents. Learning leads to knowledge, and ultimately it is knowledge that is the greatest weapon against extremism. So yes, if you teach your children a sheltered, myopic and unsupportable view of faith, then they are likely to meet extremely strong, disconfirming views at university, just as Hovind claims. They will meet people cleverer than them who believe differently, and they will be flooded with the information that they've been sheltered from for decades, and for many people this will be the end of their faith. Parents who teach their children unsupportable belief systems, which are trivially disconfirmed by modern scientific research, theological study or historical analysis, are setting their children up for a huge, painful shock when they reach university, and they are ultimately building their faith on the weakest possible foundation. Hovind and many creationists teach that evolution is a vicious lie and should never be taught to children, though in their more reasonable days they occasionally say that we should at least allot equal time for science and creationism in schools. Is that a reasonable request? After all, nearly half of all Americans, for example, believe in creationism, and so it seems fair that half our time should be allotted to that particular subject. Well, no, it isn't reasonable at all. Truth isn't determined by a democratic process, it's determined by observation, measurement, analysis and careful thought. Even if 99% of the people on Earth believe something to be true, that is not even the slightest proof that it is indeed true. It might imply that this particular claim deserves scrutiny, of course, but it doesn't count as evidence in its favour. So in school, we should teach what is true. It is indeed true that a very large number of people believe in creationism, so it's not wrong to teach that fact in its true place, which is a class on religion. That's perfectly okay. Nobody can deny that creationism is a seductive and influential belief system amongst fundamentalist religious and those with no background in science. That in itself is a fascinating sociological phenomenon and could indeed be taught in a sociology class too. But creationism itself is not science, so should not be taught in a science classroom. In fact, science has utterly disproved creationism. What we teach in science classrooms should be, unsurprisingly, scientific. The truth is that essentially no working scientists believe that creationism is anything other than a religious myth. The only ones who disagree are those very few with extremely strong fundamentalist religious views, whose salaries are often paid for by creationist organisations. And the other obvious problem with this theory is far more critical. If we teach all beliefs equally, then we must do exactly that. We must give equal time for the scientific explanation, for the Christian explanation, for the Hindu creation myths, for the Egyptian myths, the Norse myths, the Babylonian myths, the Navajo myths, the Mayan myths, the Aztec myths, the Aboriginal myths, the Inuit myths, and so on and so on. We must spend equal time teaching everything. We must spend some geography lessons teaching the flat earth theory, some teaching the belief that the earth is a spherical shell, and some teaching science. And moreover, we need to spend equal time to those who believe that the flat Earth is unsupported in space, and to those who believe the flat Earth is supported on a column, those who believe it's supported on a giant tree, or a stack of elephants, or a turtle, perhaps also including a stack of elephants, and so on. If only we had a way of reducing the number of plausible theories that we need to teach. Perhaps by examining the evidence for each one, and regardless of the emotion or popularity associated with that belief, instead just looking at whether or not it's true. We do. It's called science. It's what we teach in science lessons. As the various branches of creationism have one by one been struck down in court and demonstrated to be false, the creationists have become increasingly sneaky and underhand. Their current strategy is along the lines that we should teach the controversy between science and creationism. That is, we should acknowledge that there is a large disagreement here, and we should be honest about that and teach children about the points on which opinion differs. That all sounds perfectly reasonable, of course, until we think about it for a minute. The most fundamental objection to this entire line of reasoning is simply this: there is no controversy. If you ask 1,000 professional scientists working in reputable universities, you may, according to recent research, find that about 1/3 of those believe in God in some form. That's fine. This contrasts, of course, with around 75% of the population in the US, for example. As you go to the upper elites of the scientific institutions, the numbers reduce. A 1998 study published in the journal Nature showed that only 7% of the scientific elite, i.e. those in the National Academy of Sciences in the US, believed in a personal God. But this is all irrelevant. Scientists are free to believe whatever they want in their personal lives, and are encouraged to do so. Out of those scientists who are not religious, it's a fair bet that none of them is a creationist, of course. But even out of the religious ones, most will not be creationists. A 1997 Gallup poll showed that something like 5% of scientists, in the very broad sense, i.e. including theoretical physicists who know nothing about biology, believe in creation. I find that truly staggering, but it still represents a small minority view in terms of the greater scientific community. Once you reduce that questionnaire to those who actually understand the arguments for creationism, i.e. life scientists and earth scientists, the fraction drops to considerably under 1%, or, in a particular study, roughly 700 out of 480,000 scientists. That would mean that out of our sample of 1,000 scientists, if we restricted that list to those who studied areas in which creationism impacts on science, we would probably find one, maybe two, and perhaps even none who believed in creationism out of 1,000. Also, in addition to that, creationism doesn't exist in the academic literature. For example, in 2007 there were 6 peer-reviewed papers which mentioned creationism in the title. 5 of them were critical of teaching the subject in schools and were examining the damage that this would do to our children. The final one was a study of belief systems in Alzheimer patients. Compare this to, for example, the 8,427 papers just mentioning the word speciation. None of the ones I looked at were even remotely negative on the subject. They were all examining actual mechanisms and evidence for speciation that we see today. Nobody has sensibly believed in a young Earth for 2 centuries, and since the advent of genetics it's been impossible to doubt the theory of common descent. Giving time in school to teach that there was any kind of controversy in the subject of evolution would be massively misleading, and would be teaching our children something that was blatantly false. So the bottom line is this: we shouldn't teach the controversy because it doesn't exist. Hovind points out that most people disagree about the subject of evolution, but as I mentioned in an earlier slide, truth is not democratically determined. I have no problem with teaching children that a large number of people believe in creationism. That's a perfectly valid subject for a class in religion or sociology, but it's not okay to teach that this subject therefore has some merit. For example, most people in the world are not Christian. Christianity accounts for less than 1/3 of all human beings alive today. By Hovind's rationale, his own belief system is therefore wrong, and we should teach that Christianity is false in schools. Of course, that's not a rational line of argument, and no sensible person would ever put it forward as one. Hovind is also fond of quoting famous figures who are notably opposed to evolution. The main one is Fred Hoyle, who I mentioned in one of the first presentations in this series. Yes, it's possible to find clever people who disbelieve in evolution, but that tells us nothing whatsoever. As I said, truth is not determined by democracy, and it's not determined by meritocracy either. It's determined by scientific study, gathering and analysing evidence. Besides, as we all know, clever people sometimes say stupid things. And you can guarantee that this will be the quote that the media jumps on and publishes, leaving a lifetime of good, rational scientific work to disappear from the public view. And finally, I want to point out that PhD does not imply infallible. Just because a person who has a PhD says something, or a professor, or even someone with a Nobel Prize, that doesn't make it so. It doesn't matter who says something. We should always look for evidence, or else their quote is worthless for anything other than amusement. Hovind's aim in the field of education is very clear, and it's quite common for young Earth creationists. Hovind himself even spells it out in bullet points. He wants parents to keep their children away from anything that disagrees with their own extreme form of Christianity, and to isolate them from anything that may question their worldview. In short, Hovind wants to brainwash children by suffocating their right to freedom of thought and learning. He emphasises 4 main points. Firstly, to understand the problem, by which he means to indoctrinate yourself in his own propaganda. Secondly, he urges you to remove your children from school and from contact with the real world. Thirdly, if you cannot for some reason remove them from school, then you should at least heavily indoctrinate them, pull them out of as many classes as possible, and fill their heads with propaganda that will help them to resist reason. And finally, you should become politically active yourself by opposing the teaching of science in schools and attempting to subvert the American Constitution by promoting the teaching of one specific and myopic strand of religious fundamentalism as truth. There really isn't much to say here. The young earthers pretty much shoot themselves in their own feet. These cult-like actions are ultimately incredibly damaging for a child's mind. More importantly, there is no way that a parent can keep their child isolated forever. At some point the child will become an adult and move away from home, at which point they will suddenly encounter most or all of the viewpoints that the parents had been so keen to isolate them from. In my experience, there's pretty much nothing that can turn a child against his or her parents more strongly than the sudden realisation that they have been kept away from the full experience of their youth. Of those people I've met who had strict religious parents, most of them went completely off the rails and despised their parents for the isolation they had been forced to endure. I'm sure most parents will find this a sobering thought. If you bring your children up isolated from reality, then you'd better hope that you can keep that wall of separation up forever, or else that child will eventually be exposed to some considerable psychological stress. Children should be allowed access to the truth, and attempting to deny them this does nothing but set them up for a huge psychological fall once they get old enough to find out for themselves. The problem facing fundamentalist parents is a huge one. The best way to get anyone to hold their beliefs very strongly is to get them to examine them and counter every kind of argument that could ever be used against them. The problem with extreme religious beliefs, or any approximately literal religious beliefs, is that they inevitably crumble in the face of any half-decent logical analysis. I think that most young earthers know this, at least subconsciously, but they won't publicly admit it. So a good idea might be to suggest an analogy. In medicine, we know that children build up immunities to diseases when they've been exposed to them. This is the basis for immunisations, and for most of modern medical health. By removing their children from public schools and indoctrinating them at home, parents are essentially encasing their children in a shell of bubble wrap. Eventually, when the child goes out into the real world, they will be totally incapable of dealing with the opposition that they encounter. The strategy that Hovind encourages is to hide your children away from any disconfirming viewpoint, isolate them from anyone who might teach them to use their rational minds, drill materials into their heads like a cult leader would, and, in short, teach them to be intellectually feeble, brainwashed, and isolated. If you are a parent, I ask you to consider honestly if this is a future that you want for your child. Do you want to bring up your child as an intellectual coward who runs away from anything that they don't understand? I find that an abhorrent and thoroughly reprehensible viewpoint, and my stance is that parents holding such a medieval view on education do not deserve the honour of being responsible for the life and prosperity of another human being. Well, that's all for now. As ever, there's loads more information on my website at frame.net, where you can also find a transcript of this talk and all the following ones and all the previous ones, and you can keep up to date with my blog as well as learning about some of my other work. See you next time when I'll be talking about morality and the claims that creationists make in that regard. Does science lead to immorality and lawlessness, or is that just misleading scare tactics designed to frighten people away from thinking rationally? Thanks for listening.